This is my solo exhibition called I Am Because. It's held at D2 the Creative Centre in Larbert, and it's been on for the past 2 weeks. I'm really pleased with the way that the exhibition has come together, and the beautiful space here at D2. It's just been amazing to exhibit the works that I have. The theme of the exhibition has been that of identity, and this idea has been with me for several years. I was part of a 10-artist exhibition in 2013 called In My Bones, which again we were tasked to think about the theme of identity and create art in response to that. And I found at the time that that idea of who we are and what makes us what we are was huge. It was such a big topic that I didn't feel I did it justice, and it stayed with me until this exhibition. The exhibition has been a dream for several years, and using that theme has really driven the art that I've created. And so in response to the idea of creating art that had this theme of identity, I ended up with 7 different series of works, each representing a different aspect of who we are, what our identity is. So I thought I'd just take you through what those 7 series are, and then go into more detail in each of the different pictures within those series. So the first aspect of our identity was based on the phrase, I am because of the hand I am dealt. And this is really to do with the genetic identity that we're given when we're born. And in response to that, I've created a number of pen and ink drawings that I've called the Chromosome series. The second aspect of our identity was to do with the core of us, and the phrase I've used is I am because of the bones in me. And I've created 9 paintings of bones based on a childhood obsession with the beauty of bones and their organic nature. And like I say, that represents that part of us that doesn't change, that deep core part of us. The third series I've created is based on the phrase I am because of the way I touch the world. And I've created this series called Touch, which are based on paintings of my fingertips and represent the part of us that take action and interact with the world and how that affects who we are. The fourth of these series I've called Journey, and is based on the phrase I am because of the people around me. And this reflected the idea that we're not alone, we're part of a community, and that changes who we are. There is an African philosophy called Ubuntu, which is translated as I am because we are. And that drove the title of the exhibition, and is based around the idea that we have a responsibility to the people around us within a community to look after each other and to understand what's happening within that community. The fifth of the series of works I've done is called the Crown series, and these are 6 pieces which are built to look like crowns that represent different emotional states that I find myself in, and that also drives who I am. And I've based that on the phrase I am because of my emotions and feelings. The 6th of the series is called the Burnt series, and it's based on the phrase I am because of my scars and burns. And this looks at the idea that we are sometimes changed by the bad things that happen, the burns and the scars, and sometimes that can change us in a bad way, but sometimes in a good way as well. And then the final series I've called the Motherboard series, and this is based on the phrase I am because of the connections I make. And this looks at the way that certain people in our lives can create a deep connection with us and can actually influence the trajectory in our lives. So I'll now go through each of those 7 series in a little more detail to explain kind of what I was thinking when I created the art. So this installation of cubes is part of my series of works called Chromosome. I was quite interested in one aspect of our identity, which is basically the hand that we're dealt when we're born. We take genetic material from both parents, and it's obviously a lot of chance in terms of what characteristics we inherit. And I kind of wanted to express that in some way. And the idea of recreating the 23 pairs of human chromosomes was quite appealing to me. I started using pen and ink, well, I've been using it a long time, but I started using a Rotring mapping pen a couple of years ago. And one of the first things I did was to draw one of these chromosome drawings just by using small rectangles. The pen lets you draw very finely. And I kept drawing these rectangles until they created a circle. And I left two gaps, which were two lines representing the two chromosomes. At least that's what I thought they looked like. And then I thought, I'll challenge myself to create more of these. And I basically kept going until I created all 23 pairs of chromosomes, each in a circle representing perhaps a petri dish or looking through a magnifying glass or a microscope. But then I thought, well, I could create just the chromosomes themselves without the circle. So that became my second challenge. And so I ended up with 46 drawings, which were obviously very difficult to show in an exhibition space like this. If I had 46 drawings on a wall, it would take up the whole wall. So instead, I tried this approach where I've taken photographs that have been printed of each of the chromosome drawings and just put them onto sides of cubes made out of foam board. So it doesn't show all the images at once for you, but it allows you to look around and sort of investigate each of the cubes and see what you can see. So I really love the way this has kind of come together, and it feels like they're a set of dice that have been just randomly thrown onto this table. So these 10 pictures are 10 of my favourite chromosome drawings. They all have this kind of concept of lots of things being brought together to create a bigger thing, much in the same way as cells in a body or organs in a body or humans in a community, that we are all individuals but we make up a larger entity. This is a series of 9 paintings that I've called Bone, and again represents an aspect of our identity, which is the kind of core of us, the deep part of us that doesn't change through our lives. I've had a fascination with bones for quite a number of years, and I vividly remember as a child, probably around 11, sitting under the stairs at home with an encyclopedia that had illustrations of bones, which I would meticulously draw with a pencil in a sketchbook, including the labels of each bone. And it was just something I just loved doing. I love these shapes, the organic shapes that you had with bones. So this was me revisiting my childhood, if you like, and trying to recreate that joy of the sense of these shapes. Some of the shapes are incredible. The one at the bottom here is part of the neck, one of the neck bones, and just an amazing star shape that you get. And this kind of triangular shape you get as well, with a certain angle of these bones. And this one, which is the heel bone, just looks incredible when you see it in that kind of context. So yeah, this is a continuing fascination for me. So these 9 paintings are in the series I've called Touch. This was the first painting I did, again just as an experiment in doing an oil painting of my own fingertips. And I have done a series like this before, but just on very smaller canvases. And I wanted to really go for making these as realistic as possible, but trying to use colours that then also gave a sense of warmth and comfort. And this series represents the part of us that is driven by the actions that we take. So I felt like our fingertips and our fingers were the part of our body that we use to interact with the world, whether that be through screens or through touching the world or the people around us. So it felt very appropriate that I would use these fingertips to represent that aspect of us, and the fact that the actions that we take can then have consequences that change who we are. These pieces have been, again, resined, which I think gives them a real depth of colour. And it's a fascinating thing to draw as well, because when you think of fingers and hands, you have a very specific image of what a hand looks like and what a finger looks like. But these are very abstract shapes, these ovals, and the nails that are at an angle become really nothing like what you think of when you're drawing a finger. This is part of the series I've called The Journey, and I've got 4 pieces in this series. This is the second piece I did, which was really an experiment with using different layers of resin. So I've used about 5 layers in this, which gives it some depth. These are just small pieces of plastic that I've placed on each layer, so they can overlap each other with a little bit of a gap. And in the right light you can see small shadows. And I really wanted to represent the idea of that aspect of us that is related to the people we surround ourselves with, our community. And the title of the exhibition, I Am Because, came from the Ubuntu philosophy, I am because we are, which is really about us having a responsibility to the community that we're in, and that we should be looking after each other and looking out for each other. And I think it's something we've lost in the Western world. Ubuntu is an African philosophy. And it feels like it's something that we really need to progress as a human race. So I looked at other types of animal and how their communities held together, and the fish was really appealing. The idea of a school of fish, which provided protection and support for each other and had a sort of common purpose and a common aim. I felt that was a really nice way of thinking about a community. Interestingly, a school of fish is different to a shoal of fish. A shoal of fish is really a group of different types of fish that just happen to hang together, whereas a school of fish is a group of all of the same species of fish that keep together for specific reasons, such as protection and security, and for breeding as well. This is the very first piece I did in the Journey series, and this was the real experimental piece where I tried putting different layers of resin onto a board, and it's worked out really well. There's a real sense of depth in the resin on this piece. This is another piece I created for the Journey series, and this again is based on a school of fish that take this kind of circular motion. So I love the sense of movement in this. And it's the background is different to the others, which I've used a very blue aqua kind of background. So I just wanted to get a sense of real stark contrast with these oily black fish. And this is the final piece that I created as part of the Journey series, and this is simply called The Journey. When I first thought about having a solo exhibition, the very first thing I wanted to do was to create a large installation that would take up an entire wall. The space here at D2 is such a fantastic space, and really allows the art to breathe. And so the idea of placing these pieces against a large white wall was just so appealing to me. And these are all melted milk bottles that very gently melted in an oven, just to cause them to shrink. And then they're just painted with some oil paints to give them that blue shine, and then simply suspended from the ceiling with monofilament. The creation of this has taken quite a few years in terms of collecting the milk bottles for one thing, and I've used 9 frames that have been kind of secured to the ceiling, which has let me then place each of these, they're like fish basically, just at the right spot. And it was a piece that I wasn't sure what it would look like until it was in place, so it was always just a vision in my head. And it actually changed slightly from my original vision, which was going to be a long line of these fish swimming through the gallery. to create a lot of space at the far end, which then coalesce into a sharp point at this end of the piece. And I love that the space that they have over on this side allows these shapes of these melted milk balls to show through against the white background. And there's some incredible shapes that have been created just by randomly melting these milk bottles. So this is one of my favourite pieces in terms of the concept and the amount of work that was involved in getting here, and just seeing it come into fruition like this is just fantastic. So this series of works that I've called the Crown series represent different emotional states that I find myself in, and I've tried to use different materials and different colours to represent those emotional states. It felt like our identity is changed by so many things, but sometimes our emotions and our mental states can really take over from everything else and change completely who we are. This piece is called the Crown of Empathy. And I've used cotton buds for this simply because I felt like the cotton represented something that we use to wrap something up to keep it safe. And this represents an emotion that I have when I see my children, and now my grandchild, when they're hurt in some way, either emotionally or physically, that can affect me quite deeply, and I feel a deep empathy for them, which is quite painful. So the red represents that pain, whereas the cotton buds and the cotton, the softness of those edges, represent that want to wrap your child up in cotton wool. This piece is the Crown of Inspiration, and I use pencils, again starting with the material, to represent this idea that we can be inspired at times. And I find usually early in the morning when I wake up, those are the times when I come up with great ideas, or that I solve a problem that's been with me for the day before and I've struggled to solve it. So I love using these sorts of materials. It's quite a challenge, but with this one I started with the pencil and I thought, what can I do with this object? And creating this pattern, so obviously the crowns I was trying to represent a circular shape, so using these patterns was really intriguing to me. The challenge then was how to secure this as a piece of art, and it's involved quite a lot of resin and quite a lot of wires going through the pencils to hold them safely in place. This piece I've called the Crown of Pain. And from a distance, it looks maybe like a starry sky or a galaxy that's spinning. And some of the children that have visited the exhibition have pointed that out. This is like a spinning galaxy to them. But as you come closer, you realise that these are made up of small models of tablets and pills that I've created just using Fimo. And this is quite a simple thing to make in terms of just scattering these onto the resin before it sets. And I think it's created a really beautiful kind of, the dull tablets against the shiny blue background really stands out for me. This really represents the aspect of me that kind of takes over if I'm in any sort of pain. So, unfortunately, I'm not one who suffers from pain very often, but these times happen, and it completely takes over your life. It becomes the number one thing that affects who you are. And the thought of having chronic pain, for instance, it must be awful for people who live with pain, for most of their lives. So I wanted to represent this for myself, but also for others who have that kind of thing in their lives, which can be very dark and can really change who they are. So this is the Crown of Pain. This piece was the first crown that I made, and it's called the Crown of Regret. It represents times that I find myself going back sometimes many, many years to a point in time where I've said something or I've done something that I regretted and I still regret. And these are things often that completely forgotten by other people, and I'm the only one who remembers that time, but it still haunts me. And some of these things can be 20 or 30 years ago, and they still come back and haunt me, and I wish I'd made a different decision or said something differently. I used bamboo skewers for this to create these jagged edges, and they're brilliant when they break. They create these really jagged points, as well as the very sharp edges that you use to obviously skewer meat. Again, I've used resin to secure the crown itself, and there's been holes drilled in the boards to let me then sink the crown into the board, and then it's covered with resin. And I've used this very bright orange colour to really show off the darkness of this crown. This is one of the darker crowns that I've created. This crown represents the part of me that wants things, even though I don't need them. And we're all affected by this kind of materialistic thinking sometimes. Sometimes it can be driven by advertising or just the social media. And there can be a real pressure to kind of own things and to try and find happiness through objects. It's something that's got less for me over time. As I get older, I find I don't feel I need these things anymore, because I don't feel they often bring happiness. But I wanted to represent this idea, and again the material kind of drove this idea, using these plastic cutlery, which I thought were really fascinating shapes. And again, as soon as I put them in a circle, I'd found my crown, and this was quite quick to kind of come together. They've been laid directly onto the wet resin again, and allowed to dry within the resin, and that means the resin kind of grips them. And I think it's a really interesting kind of shape, again, which people from a distance don't always realise what the material is until they come closer. So this was the last of the crowns that I made. This one is created using small pieces of Fimo, and they've been shaped into models of red blood cells, just sort of that slightly concave shape. And I wanted to use the idea of blood to create this crown of passion. And this represents something in me that can take over my identity because I've become passionate about something. This art exhibition, for instance, has been a passion of mine for several years, and it's really driven me and changed who I am. Sometimes it's not always a good thing, so sometimes I can focus on one particular thing at the expense of other things. And I've always got to be careful not to focus too much on one thing at the expense of family and friends and things like that. These are two of the pieces that are in my burnt series, and I've used burnt matches to represent that part of our identity that's related to the burns and the scars and the damage that inevitably affect us in our lives. And I think sometimes these scars and burns can affect us in a negative way, can change who we are quite negatively, but sometimes they can change us in a positive way. This idea of strength being born through fire. So I wanted to use a material that represented that, and these burnt matches were just an obvious way for me to represent that idea of burns and scars. And I've used both the matches themselves, but also the sort of shapes. With this piece, for instance, I've just used two lines, which could be scar lines, and I've let the matches fall away from these lines sort of naturally until they meet up in the middle and created this lovely shape, which to me was like a seed. So it's kind of like the seeds of plants that grow once a bushfire has finished, and they grow out of the ash, for instance. That was what was in my head with this one. And again, with this one, it was just another idea where I just took a line, a single line, which could be a scar line or some sort of break, and let the matches fall naturally away and created this beautiful shape. This is another piece that's in my burnt series called The Scar. This actually sat in my loft for several years in an unfinished state where I just started with the 2 lines and let the matches fall, but I hadn't joined them in the middle. And it was gathering dust, and I think about a year ago I decided I would finish it. I kind of lost interest in it for some reason, but as I worked on the piece and these matches came together into this central line, it became to me like a scar line. And then I realised it was very similar to the scar line that was on my father's chest after he'd had heart surgery when I was a teenager. And this was really interesting because the kind of meaning of the art revealed itself as I worked on it and finished it. So there was no intentional idea that this would be about that part of my life, but that's how it ended up. So, and these lines almost become the lungs or the 2 sides of a body. So this is one of the pieces I'm particularly fond of because of that personal connection that I have. So it's really about a burn or a scar that's in my own life. This is another piece in my burnt series called The Chasm. And in this case I've taken the idea of having 2 sides that were trying to reach each other or connect in some way, but not quite making it. So it's left this chasm. And it could also be 2 waves crashing together. And in between I've left this filled with ash that I've kind of collected from burning all these matches. So again, I love the pattern that's created as you let the matches gracefully fall away from these 2 lines. The final piece that I created in my burnt series were these burnt worlds that I've called them. Each took a long time to make, and as you can see, some of them are unfinished. And that's been on purpose because I didn't want these to be all complete in a sense of, I liked the broken gaps that are found in these pieces sort of represent the fact that we're not all complete and we've all got parts of us that are broken. These were challenging in the sense that they did take a long time to create, but they create such a beautiful kind of colour and texture that I just fell in love with, and I just kept going with these. It became a sort of mindfulness exercise in creating them, and it let my mind wander as I put the matches in one by one. I quite like the ones as well that are kind of merged together, sort of 2 spheres joined together. And I think sometimes our burns and our scars can be tied with other people, and sort of, you know, we end up having this kind of state of being joined. So I wasn't sure how to display these in the exhibition because I could have chosen all sorts of ways. I did think about suspending them from the ceiling, for instance, but when we found this plinth, which is 2.5 meters square, just sitting them just loosely like this just felt right. They'd just given them a real space and just a sense of them being scattered like a galaxy or a solar system of planets. This is one of the pieces that's in my Motherboard series, and the idea of this series was creating pieces of art that related to the connections we make with other people. I've certainly been aware in my own life that there have been certain people that have had a dramatic effect on the direction of my life, and some of those people are teachers, some are the family that I have around me, and it's interesting how, you know, a person's action can change someone else's life. And I think that's what I found in my own life, that something someone has said to me or something someone has done has put me on a completely different trajectory. So I wanted to somehow represent these connections between people. And these motherboard pieces were really another experiment in material. So I was using a thick gloss paint and just letting them drip. So there's a technique I use where I just use a thin stick and I'd take some paint on the end of the stick and it would just slowly fall off. So I'd let it drip and then I'd move the stick from along this grid. So I'd draw out a grid in pencil and just move it randomly until the paint ran out. And basically what it did was created, at least to start with, very thick lines between the points, these strong connections between these different points on the grid. And then gradually these connections petered out until there was hardly anything. And to me then it felt like these were like the connections we make with other people, and very often we meet somebody who really has a very little effect on our lives, and that has that very superficial connection. But like I say, sometimes that connection can be very deep and very long lasting. So this kind of represents that. I mean, it's not an obvious connection sometimes, but that's what I was thinking about when I created these pieces. This one in particular, it was meant actually to be sideways and representing a kind of a kiss between these two things. But in terms of practicality, this was the space that we had to display it. So I decided we'd display it vertically. And it's become a little more interesting, I think, in terms of it now looks like more of a timer, you know, sort of sands dripping through a timer. So yeah, I'm really pleased with the result.